One of the hardest things to square in the theism debate is the fact that so many people seem to have greatly different views of what it takes to know something, how you can or cannot know that God exists, and what amount of evidence would qualify as proving the existence of God, or what would be sufficient to convince someone. Many people thus make claims like no amount of evidence would convince them of the existence of God, or while saying that something would convince them, it's fundamentally unattainable, or they simply place a higher burden of evidence for the existence of God than they would for any other topic. Now, my goal in this video is not to give you the amount of evidence that I think you should need to be convinced of God's existence, but I do aim to help you to understand one fundamental factor when it comes to the concept of knowledge itself and the consequences of it.
The crux of the issue revolves around the philosophical branch known as epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, that is, what can we consider to be knowledge and whether we can even obtain knowledge. The most fundamental question to answer here when trying to figure out if God exists, or if anything exists for that matter, is whether we can know anything at all. There are two camps that you can fall under in this discussion, and that is fallibilism and infallibilism. Infallibilism is the view that you need 100% certainty to have knowledge, while fallibilism is the idea that you only need to be really sure of something to have knowledge regarding it. Now, it should be noted that in contemporary philosophy, infallibilism is a very difficult position to hold. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because the thought comes to mind, how can you know something if you're uncertain about it? Because there's always a possibility that you're being deceived or that you're wrong. And the few people that support infallibilism like to bring up stuff like this, just as René Descartes did when he underwent his first meditation. On one day in the 17th century, a man named René Descartes decided that he did not want to be deceived in any way whatsoever. So he started his first meditation in which he bulldozed all the beliefs he had in which he did not have 100% certainty. In doing this, he came up with several theoretical scenarios in which he could demonstrate his uncertainty, the most notable of which being the evil demon argument, which went something like this. Imagine a universe in which there is an omnipotent and malevolent evil demon that has the ability to manipulate our senses and inferences to make us see and believe anything that it wants. If such a demon exists, then we would have no way of ever being sure about anything regarding the external world, since everything we perceive is a deception. Furthermore, in order to have certainty of anything regarding the world, you must rule out the evil demon hypothesis. You cannot rule out the evil demon hypothesis because in this scenario, the evil demon would deceive all of our perceptions. Therefore, you cannot have certainty of any knowledge about the external world. Now, I understand why, if you haven't encountered this argument before, that it would seem utterly preposterous. But in the world of philosophy, this is one of the most influential arguments ever devised. Because whether you like it or not, we can never rule out the possibility that at any given moment we're being deceived. Now, a lot of people have tried to rebuke or overcome this argument, but arguably they all fell, including Descartes himself. In Descartes' second meditation, he tries to build back up his knowledge of the world by establishing the one foundational belief that he can be certain of in this scenario. I think, therefore I am. As long as Descartes is thinking, he can be sure that he exists. This is a pretty good argument, and probably the single most popular phrase in philosophy. But Descartes doesn't really get much farther than this. In the third meditation, he tries to build up his knowledge from here by making a pretty terrible deductive argument for the existence of God, in which he inferences that since he can imagine a completely perfect God, and each idea is caused by something at least as perfect as the idea, that a completely perfect God must exist. Yeah, this argument is about as silly as it sounds. This is also really bad because without God, Descartes could not be sure that there isn't an evil demon, because he goes on to argue that a perfect God wouldn't allow him to be deceived in this way. But since he can't demonstrate that God exists, he cannot be sure that there isn't an evil demon. And beyond its obvious incorrectness, there is a more fundamental issue going on here that is going to take down not only this belief, but all the foundational beliefs before it. This is the fact that Descartes is having to make an inference. If you recall the evil demon argument, the evil demon is able to confuse your sense of reason such that you cannot make inferences. Moreover, Descartes operated under the idea of the incorrigibility of the mind, which is the idea that you can know what's going on in your mind at any given moment, in its totality. However, nobody really operates under this idea anymore, especially since the work of Sigmund Freud. And what this means is that Descartes definitively cannot defeat the evil demon argument. Now, I know that I didn't really get into any of the other arguments made against the evil demon, but for the sake of time, it suffices to say that none of them really work. Especially historically, you look at all the arguments, contemporary philosophy is pretty sure that most of those arguments are bad. And this has serious implications on what we understand about knowledge. If you cannot beat the evil demon argument, then you functionally cannot be an infallibilist, because if you took your philosophical paradigm, i.e. your worldview, to the extreme, then you would know nothing more than the fact that you exist, and even that's debatable. So what this means is that if you want to be certain of anything more than the fact that you exist, then you need to bite the bullet and concede that you don't need 100% certainty of something to have knowledge regarding it. Because you and I are pretty sure that there's not an evil demon that's overlooking us at all times and giving us terrible ideas.
Alright, so there's one thing that I'm skipping out on here, and that's the position of skepticism. Skepticism is essentially choosing to be an infallibilist while still trying to operate in the world, rather than sitting on the ground sad all the time, because there's a remote possibility that there's a demon in your head and you can't know anything about anything.
For instance, a skeptic cannot know for certain that when they enter their car to drive, that the car won't cease to exist. So, they have the contingency of calling a taxi. Skeptics also like to bring up the arguments to support their skepticism, such as the fact that even though the statistical probability of you winning the lottery is near zero, many fallibilists will insist on believing that there is a chance that you can win the lottery, even though their paradigm would tell them to just believe that they have knowledge that they won't win the lottery, because the chances are so low. There are several problems with this outlook, and the first that should be mentioned is the fact that the lottery objection fails. And this is because there are actually different forms of fallibilism that have different measures for certainty, and some even have variable measures of certainty that can account for the lottery scenario, and we'll discuss those momentarily. But for the time being, we'll move on to the big problem with skepticism as I see it. And that is the fact that while people may claim to be skeptics, they're functionally fallibilists. And that can easily be deduced because of the fact that no matter what you believe in principle, it is unlikely that you are making contingencies at every given moment for any given thing that a skeptic can doubt. Moreover, it would seem likely that these skeptics do oftentimes take things for granted, such as the fact that if they think about lifting their arm, it will lift. And that if they take a step forward in the living room on a flat surface, that their foot will land. While they may occasionally think about this and be like, oh yeah, there is a possibility that I don't even have arms, and that whenever I'm thinking about moving my arms, that they won't move. But I'm certain that most of the time whenever they start walking, that they're not thinking about that. It's for this reason that it's doubtable that you could really be a skeptic, because of the amount of assumptions that you would have to throw out the window, that most people still entertain whether they like it or not. Skeptics may say that you cannot have knowledge as it is a natural result of infallibilism, but they treat many things as knowledge, even if they will not concede that it is knowledge. The result of this is cognitive dissonance between what you practice and what you say that you believe. And I would say that this cognitive dissonance is an undesirable worldview. So we are left with fallibilism. Alright, that was a lot. Is everyone hanging in there? TikTok has ruined our attention span so much that I have to use innovative tactics to keep everyone invested. Perhaps I should just add little videos at the bottom of the screen like those TikTok videos, so you can have enough information coming into your brain so that it'll stimulate it. But if you're still around, please consider liking and subscribing so I can keep making content like this. Anyway, it's interesting though, because the skeptic seems to be quite like a form of fallibilist called contextualist. And this is a variety of fallibilism in which the amount of certainty you need and whether or not you have knowledge depends on the context that you're talking in. For the contextualist, you might expect a conversation like this to occur. Say you have an inquisitive child that asks their father how many people there are in the world, and the father responds, billions. But the father's friend is there, and because he's a smart aleck, he decides to butt in and say, well, how do you know that there are billions and that you aren't in a simulation with just you? And the father responds by saying, well, yes, technically, in that context, I cannot be sure that there are billions of people, let alone tens of people. But I'm not talking about existential questions of skepticism. We are just talking about the context of ordinary knowledge and life affairs. Stop trying to confuse my child and leave us alone, you crazy person. Another example may be the question of whether your child is tall or not. Say that your kid is on the first grade basketball team and he experienced a growth spurt way earlier than all the other kids, such that he is a foot taller than the rest of them. In this case, you can say that you know that the kid is tall. You have knowledge that he is tall. But if you were comparing your child to professional basketball players, or even to yourself, he's short. In that context, you know that your child is short. As you can see, for contextualists, whether or not you have knowledge or whether or not something is true can depend on the context in which you're speaking. Whether you're talking about some deep philosophical question, or you're just talking about your ordinary affairs, in which
you seem to know something, and that knowledge seems to be reliable and consistent. Some people object to this kind of measure of knowledge because it's inconsistent, since you can both claim to know something and to not know something at the same time. But proponents of this kind of fallibilism would say that this view is more nuanced than simply saying that you know something when you may not, and more functional than claiming to not know something when the supposed knowledge is useful and functional on a day-to-day basis and in ordinary conversation. And back to what I was saying before, it seems to me that skeptics often functionally act as contextualists, because I'm pretty sure that if a skeptic has had a long day at work and they're ready to relax and they ask their daughter to hand them the TV remote, they aren't going to say, "Sweetie, I want you to hand me the remote, but I'm well prepared for the situation in which the remote doesn't actually work, or what you're picking up is something merely disguised as a TV remote." No, I don't think anyone is going to do that. Maybe if their daughter tries to play with them and act like they cannot be sure that the remote exists, the skeptic will concede that this is the case, but I'm sure that in most cases, they'll just take it for granted that the TV remote is on the stand that's on the opposite side of the couch. I'm sure you can see how this is very similar to the contextualist. But there's another form of fallibilism which merits discussion, and that's pragmatic encroachment. Pragmatic encroachment, in some ways, has an even more radical measure of knowledge. For the proponent of pragmatic encroachment, whether or not you can have knowledge regarding a specific matter is affected by pragmatic considerations or practical considerations. In other words, you can have a question of knowledge in two different subjects that have equal justification on all normal metrics of reason and evidence, but you claim to have knowledge in one situation and not in the other, simply because of practical considerations. For instance, you may be a little uncertain as to whether or not the bank is open tomorrow, and you decide that you do know the bank is open, even though you may only be 85% sure, because even if the bank isn't open, the money you're pulling out isn't due until 2 weeks from now. In this situation, the stakes aren't very high, so the bar for knowledge may be lower since there isn't much at stake.
However, one can imagine an alternate scenario where you need to get the money from the bank, but the money is due next Monday, and if you don't pay up, your car is going to get repoed. In this case, like the other, you're unsure whether the bank is open tomorrow, let's say Saturday. In this case, there's much more at stake since the payment due date is imminent and you need to ensure you get that money before then. In this case, the 85% certainty may not be sufficient, so you decide that you don't know the bank is open tomorrow, and so you look for more evidence on Google to see if it's open.
As you can see, for contextualists, whether or not you have knowledge or whether or not something is true can depend on the context in which you're speaking. Whether you're talking about some deep philosophical question, or you're just talking about your ordinary affairs in which you seem to know something and that knowledge seems to be reliable and consistent. Some people object to this kind of measure of knowledge because it's inconsistent, since you can both claim to know something and to not know something at the same time. But proponents of this kind of fallibilism would say that this view is more nuanced than simply saying that you know something when you may not, and more functional than claiming to not know something when the supposed knowledge is useful and functional on a day-to-day basis and in ordinary conversation.
You can find a strong argument for this in the matter of whether God exists. Christianity and many other religions claim serious consequences on whether or not their religion is true. For Christianity, this can mean the difference between everlasting bliss and everlasting torment, for instance. Although, as a side note, I'm not sure that this is the most helpful understanding of hell. But back to the topic at hand. Whether or not Christianity is true or not can also have serious consequences on how you understand how the world came about. It can change your entire metaphysical paradigm. It is for this reason that you find quotes like this: "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Since the practical consequences of a God existing is so large, an atheist can argue that you would need an above-average level of evidence in order to justify claiming knowledge of God's existence. This sort of idea is precisely an example of pragmatic encroachment.
Another perspective of this may be the Christian proponent of pragmatic encroachment, who may claim something like Pascal's wager, where you have more to lose if you don't believe in God than you have to lose if you do. You actually gain a lot more, because as an atheist, you would not believe in an afterlife, so you only have to gain by getting to go to heaven. But if you're wrong, the consequences are pretty dire. As Pascal puts it, if you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. In this case, despite maybe not having as much certainty as you would like to have, the pragmatic considerations make it such that you are willing to claim knowledge with less evidence. Although I'd say there's a lot of evidence. Now, to recap our exploration of fallibilism and infallibilism, it's less desirable to be an infallibilist because almost no knowledge can be claimed as an infallibilist, and we want to be able to say we know things.
Moreover, it's also not good to be a skeptic because of the cognitive dissonance between what you say you believe and what you seem to believe in practice on a daily basis. It is therefore most desirable to be a fallibilist. And being a fallibilist means that you don't need 100% certainty in order to claim knowledge. The question that should be asked then is, how much certainty do you need? Well, what's the answer? It's up to you. You need to decide how much certainty you think you should need in order to claim knowledge. You also need to decide whether you want to keep that same bar of certainty for every topic, or if you want to include pragmatic considerations, or if you even want to base your knowledge claims on the context in which you're speaking. These are possibilities, and there are many more, as there are many ways of being a fallibilist. Ultimately, there are tons of options for you. You could even disregard my analysis and choose to be a skeptic, or you could try to do a better job at building up your foundational beliefs than Descartes did. I believe in you. But the choice is an important one, because what you know is the basis of your reality. Being able to discern between what is and what is not knowledge is foundational to being able to build up your worldview. We now know that we don't need 100% certainty in order to claim knowledge, but the rest is up to you.